On April 5th, 1764, in the bustling streets of Boston, merchants gathered to discuss the implications of a new law that would soon change their lives forever. Word had spread that the British Parliament was considering the Sugar Act, a measure designed to raise revenue from the American colonies by taxing sugar and molasses imported from the West Indies. With a weight of authority, the act proposed a reduced tax on molasses, but it was a tax nonetheless, a reminder of British control that stung the colonists deeply. In the dim light of a tavern, a heated debate erupted among merchants like James Otis, who argued, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." His voice reverberated through the room, igniting a fire in the hearts of those gathered. They were not merely discussing tariffs, they were contemplating their very rights as Englishmen. The tavern, filled with the scent of tobacco and the murmur of anxious voices, became a crucible for revolutionary thought. As the tension mounted, news arrived of a customs official, Samuel Adams, who had been observing the gathering with keen eyes. Adams, a key figure in the emerging resistance, knew that the Sugar Act would not only affect the merchants, but the livelihoods of many colonists. "This is not just about sugar," he pressed, his hands gesturing passionately. "This is a fight for our freedom." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Adams, who understood the stakes involved. The act threatened to cripple the economy of the colonies while further tightening the grip of British authority. The merchants, once concerned only with profit margins, now felt the stirrings of a collective identity, a burgeoning sense of unity against oppression. But in the shadows of this gathering, whispers of dissent were brewing. Loyalists, those who remained faithful to the crown, were equally present, ready to report any signs of rebellion. Their presence heightened the stakes. Betrayal lurked in every corner. As tensions escalated, a loyalist named Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, received word of the meeting. He would not allow the colonists to defy the will of the crown. But to understand how we got here, we must explore the roots of this conflict. We must delve deeper into the lives of those who felt the heavy hand of British rule, revealing not just the events that led up to the Sugar Act, but the very fabric of colonial society that would be forever altered in the fight for independence. As the year 1764 unfolded, the streets of Boston were alive with the murmur of discontent. The city, with its narrow lanes and wooden structures, was a bustling hub of commerce and trade, where merchants hustled to sell their wares and taverns echoed with the voices of men discussing the latest news. Amidst this atmosphere of ambition and hope, a palpable tension simmered beneath the surface. The Sugar Act, introduced on April 5th of that year, was a turning point that would shape the course of colonial America. In the heart of Boston, James Otis, a prominent lawyer and fierce advocate for colonial rights, stood before a gathering of townspeople. His voice rose above the clamor, impassioned yet measured. He stated, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." Otis, known for his eloquence and dedication to the cause of liberty, had begun to draw the ire of those who viewed his rhetoric as incendiary. He had a sharp mind, honed through years of legal practice, and a deep sense of justice that compelled him to speak out against the injustices imposed by the British Crown. The crowd listened intently, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension as they contemplated the implications of the Sugar Act. This new legislation sought to curb smuggling and increase revenue for Britain, imposing duties on sugar, molasses, and other goods imported into the colonies. By reducing the tax on molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon, the British government aimed to encourage legal trade while simultaneously enforcing compliance. However, many colonists viewed this as a blatant attempt to exert control over their economic lives. Samuel Adams, a fellow leader in the growing resistance, was particularly vocal. He articulated the frustrations of the people, recognizing that this act was more than a financial burden, it was a direct assault on their freedoms. He declared, "If we are taxed without our consent, we are slaves." Adams, known for his organizational skills and charisma, was not merely a figurehead, but a man of the people. He understood their struggles and fears, having grown up in a world where the colonial merchant class was beginning to assert its influence. The tension between the colonies and Britain was deepening, and Adams was determined to harness this unrest. In the taverns of Boston, he gathered like-minded individuals, rallying them to form the Sons of Liberty, an organization dedicated to resisting British oppression through both peaceful protest and direct action. Yet it was not just the merchants and politicians who felt the weight of the Sugar Act. The common people, artisans, and laborers were also caught in the crossfire. Many of them relied on the importation of sugar and molasses for their livelihoods, producing rum that was central to both the economy and social life of the colonies. A shipwright, working late into the evening, spoke with his fellow craftsmen about the potential consequences. "If they raise taxes on our goods, how will we feed our families?" he lamented. His words resonated with those around him, echoing the fears of a populace that felt increasingly marginalized. The discontent was not confined to Boston. Across the colonies, similar sentiments were brewing. In New York, merchants organized boycotts against British goods. While in Philadelphia, pamphleteers like Thomas Paine began to circulate ideas that questioned the very fabric of British authority. The act was a catalyst, igniting a fire that would spread far beyond Massachusetts. The sense of unity among the colonies began to take shape, fueled by a shared understanding of their rights and the injustices they faced. In the quiet moments of contemplation, many colonists looked to the past for inspiration. The memory of the French and Indian War still loomed large, a conflict that had united the colonies against a common enemy, but had also left them burdened with debt. The aftermath of the war had fostered a growing sense of identity among the colonists, who now found themselves questioning their allegiance to a distant crown that seemed indifferent to their struggles. As historian Gordon S. Wood noted, the war had made Americans aware of their common interests, and that awareness was now leading them to consider their rights. In the taverns, discussions often turned to the legacy of their forebears, the ideals of liberty and self-governance that had been laid down by the Founding Fathers. The writings of John Locke were frequently cited, emphasizing the natural rights of individuals and the social contract that bound them to their government. As these ideas circulated, they began to resonate deeply with the populace. The notion that they had the right to govern themselves, to resist tyranny, became a rallying cry for many. Yet the British government remained steadfast in its approach. The Sugar Act was but a precursor to more stringent measures that were to come, and the resolve of the colonists would soon be tested further. In the face of growing unrest, figures like Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, stood as a symbol of British authority. He argued for the necessity of the act in maintaining order and supporting the British military presence in the colonies. His words often fell on deaf ears, as the increasing tension between the Crown and its subjects reached a boiling point. As the summer of 1764 approached, the fate of the colonies hung in the balance. The Sugar Act had set in motion a series of events that would lead to a revolution. The people of Boston, and indeed the entire continent, were awakening to the reality that their rights were under siege. With each passing day, the resolve of the colonists grew stronger, fueled by a shared vision of freedom and an indomitable spirit of resistance. They were no longer just subjects of the Crown, they were beginning to see themselves as something greater, a united front against oppression, ready to claim their place in history. And so, in the taverns, on the streets, and within the hearts of ordinary people, the seeds of revolution were planted. The Sugar Act had ignited a flame of discontent that would soon spread across the colonies, leading to a confrontation that would change the course of history forever. The struggle for liberty had begun, and the echoes of their voices would soon demand to be heard. In the spring of 1764, a sense of unease settled over Boston, a city brimming with ambition and discontent. On April 5th, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act, a measure designed to bolster revenue from the colonies. The new law reduced the existing tax on molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon, but it also enforced stricter regulations on smuggling and increased the power of customs officials. The act aimed to reshape colonial commerce to ensure that the Crown benefited from every transaction, no matter how small. For the merchants and traders of Boston, this was not merely an economic adjustment, it was a harbinger of tightening control over their livelihoods. As news of the Sugar Act spread, Samuel Adams gathered with fellow patriots in the dim light of a tavern on King Street. With the scent of rum and tobacco in the air, Adams, a fervent advocate for colonial rights, addressed the group, his voice steady but urgent. "This is but a first step into deeper tyranny," he warned, his eyes glinting with conviction. "If we do not stand against this, what will come next? Our rights will be stripped away, one penny at a time." His words resonated deeply, echoing in the hearts of those who had long felt the pressure of British rule. James Otis, another key figure in the burgeoning resistance, had already made his mark as a fierce opponent of British policies. He had famously declared, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." Otis's passionate speeches ignited the spirit of dissent among the colonists, and as they shared their fears over tankards of ale, the seeds of solidarity were planted. In the tavern that night, voices united in a chorus of resolve. The Sugar Act would not pass unnoticed. The colonists were beginning to understand that their struggle was not only about tax rates, but about their rights as Englishmen. With the Sugar Act, the British government sought to exert its authority, but it inadvertently sowed the seeds of rebellion. The Act's enforcement would require a network of customs officers to monitor ports and roads, a task met with hostility by many colonists. On the streets of Boston, rumors swirled of potential uprisings. The citizens, once complacent in their acceptance of British governance, began to question their relationship with the Crown. Letters circulated calling for unity against the encroachment of British policies. "An attack on one is an attack on all," some would write, invoking a sense of shared purpose. Tensions grew palpable as the Act came into effect. In June of that year, British customs agents began seizing ships suspected of smuggling. The merchants, whose livelihoods depended on trade, found themselves facing not only financial ruin, but also the prospect of imprisonment. The docks, usually bustling with activity, grew tense with uncertainty. The sound of haggling over prices was replaced by conversations laced with fear and anger. A merchant named John Hancock, already a prominent figure in Boston, found himself at the center of the storm. He was accused of smuggling and faced the wrath of British authorities, becoming a symbol of resistance. As the summer wore on, pamphlets emerged detailing the injustices of the Sugar Act. Printed by local printers, these documents called for boycotts of British goods and rallied support for a collective response. The words of Adams and Otis resonated within them, urging their fellow colonists to act. The cry for liberty grew louder, echoing through the streets of Boston. The people believed they were on the cusp of something greater, a movement towards independence and self-governance. In August 1764, a group of artisans and laborers gathered to form the Sons of Liberty, a secret organization dedicated to resisting British policies. They met under the cover of night, their faces illuminated only by the flickering light of oil lamps. Their banners, crafted from cloth, bore symbols of freedom and defiance. The Sons of Liberty organized protests and demonstrations, employing tactics that would soon become their hallmark. The people who joined understood that this was not just a fight for their own economic interests, but a struggle for their fundamental rights as free men. On the eve of the Sugar Act's enforcement, the city felt charged with a new energy. The streets were filled with determined men and women who sensed change was imminent. As they gathered in public squares, their voices rose in unison, proclaiming their rights and grievances. "We shall not be treated as subjects, but as equals," they declared. This newfound unity was a striking contrast to the isolation many had felt in the past. The Sugar Act had become the catalyst for a collective identity, one forged in the fires of shared struggle. Yet, amid the rising tide of resistance, a deep undercurrent of fear ran through the colonies. The British authorities, aware of the growing dissent, began to tighten their grip. Troops were dispatched to maintain order, and with each passing day, the specter of violence loomed larger. The colonists, however, were undeterred. They rallied against not just the Sugar Act, but against the broader implications of British rule. The path toward revolution was fraught with peril, yet the people believed they were standing at a historic crossroads. As autumn approached, the discussions around the Sugar Act continued to echo in taverns and town halls. The Act, initially perceived as a mere tax adjustment, had transformed into a symbol of oppression. The stakes were high, and the citizens of Boston were awakening to the reality that their fight was only beginning. With each passing day, the resolve of the colonists grew stronger, fueled by a shared vision of freedom and justice. The Sugar Act had awakened a spirit of resistance, one that would soon ripple across the colonies, igniting a fervor for independence that could not be contained. In this moment of rising tension and burgeoning unity, the people of Boston began to believe they were part of something larger than themselves, a movement that would reshape their destinies and alter the course of history. The Sugar Act was not merely a tax. It was a challenge to their very existence, and they would rise to meet it. James Otis stood at the crowded tavern in Boston on May 29, 1764, the air thick with tension and the scent of spilled ale. He had gathered local merchants and tradesmen, their faces a mixture of anger and fear. "The Sugar Act is not merely a tax on molasses," he proclaimed, his voice rising above the murmurs of discontent, "but a violation of our rights as free men." The Act, passed by Parliament, had reduced the tax on imported molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon. But it also expanded enforcement mechanisms, allowing customs officials to seize ships suspected of smuggling without due process. As Otis spoke, the gravity of his words settled among the crowd. The implications were clear. The British government was tightening its grip, and the once cordial relationship between the colonies and the Crown was fraying dangerously. One merchant, John Hancock, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "If we submit to this, what comes next? A tax on our newspapers? Our tea?" His words ignited a passionate response. The atmosphere shifted from mere discontent to a collective conviction that a stand must be taken. On June 1st, the first ship arrived in Boston Harbor after the enactment of the Sugar Act. The brigantine Hannah, laden with sugar and rum, was met with a mix of anticipation and dread. Customs officials, empowered by the new law, boarded the ship with the intent to inspect its cargo thoroughly. "The Act gives them the power to ruin us," whispered a crew member to a dock worker. "They can take our goods and our livelihoods." This fear was not unfounded. The specter of financial ruin loomed over many families, and the tension in the air became palpable. Meanwhile, Samuel Adams, observing from the shadows, recognized the potential of this moment. He rallied a group of like-minded patriots, urging them to form a committee of correspondence. "We must unite the colonies against this tyranny," he declared. "If we do not act now, we will lose everything." On July 4, 1764, the committee convened, sharing intelligence about British actions and organizing protests. The words of Otis and Hancock resonated throughout the colony, echoing in the hearts of men who felt their rights were being stripped away. By August, the situation escalated. The Sons of Liberty, an organization composed of craftsmen, merchants, and tradesmen, emerged as a formidable force against British authority. They organized protests, and on August 14th, a mob gathered in Boston, their voices unified in anger. "Liberty or death," they cried, echoing sentiments that would soon become rallying cries. The tension erupted when they turned their ire toward the home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. "He supports this tyranny," shouted one man, and the crowd surged forward, smashing windows and demanding accountability. Hutchinson, caught in the turmoil, understood the stakes. On August 16th, he wrote to a friend, "The situation here is dire. The people feel their liberties threatened, and if I do not act, my home may become a target." He feared for his safety as much as his position. The destruction of his home symbolized the colonists' rage. It was not merely a personal attack, but an assault on the authority of British governance itself. As the summer waned, the economic repercussions of the Sugar Act became increasingly dire. By September 1764, reports flooded in from merchants struggling to comply with the new regulations. One merchant, lamenting the financial strain, noted in a letter to his cousin, "I have lost half of my business since the Act was enforced. The British are suffocating us." The economic turmoil was felt most acutely among the small traders, who found it nearly impossible to navigate the new regulations without risking bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the British government remained largely oblivious to the rising tide of dissent. In December, Lord Grenville, the Prime Minister, wrote in a letter, "The colonies must learn to accept the necessity of taxation for the protection of the empire." His words reflected a profound misunderstanding of the colonial sentiment, that taxation without representation was a violation of their rights, not a necessity. The crisis reached a boiling point on March 5, 1770, with the Boston Massacre, a direct consequence of the escalating tensions. As British soldiers faced a crowd of colonists, the air thick with shouts and the clash of wills, a single gunshot rang out. Chaos ensued as soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 men, including Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed African and Native American descent, who became known as the first martyr of the American Revolution. The event sent shockwaves through the colonies, igniting a firestorm of outrage and solidifying the resolve among the colonists. In the aftermath, Samuel Adams capitalized on the momentum, calling for unity against British oppression. "We cannot let this act of violence go unanswered," he urged. The streets of Boston, once filled with the sounds of commerce, now echoed with the calls for justice and freedom. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and the conflict that began with the Sugar Act had now transformed into a struggle for independence. As the year closed, and with it the shadows of the past now intertwined with the hopes for the future, the colonists stood at a precipice. The human cost had been staggering, lives lost, families shattered, and communities divided. The clamor for freedom grew louder, the resolve deeper. The Sugar Act, initially perceived as a mere tax, had catalyzed a revolution, setting the stage for the birth of a nation. On the cold, dark streets of Boston, as the candles flickered in the taverns, the conversations shifted from mere survival to a shared dream of liberty. The journey toward independence had begun, and the echoes of those early protests would resonate through the ages, reminding future generations of the price paid for freedom. On the evening of August 14, 1764, the air in Boston was thick with anticipation and tension. Samuel Adams, flanked by fellow patriots, gathered in the back room of the Green Dragon Tavern, a favored meeting place for those who sought to resist the encroachments of British authority. The tavern, filled with the scent of ale and the murmur of hushed voices, became a crucible for revolutionary thought. Adams stood at the center, his voice steady and resolute as he spoke of resistance to the newly enacted Sugar Act, which had reduced the tax on molasses but imposed stricter enforcement measures. "We must not suffer ourselves to be robbed of our liberties," he declared, igniting a fire in the hearts of the men gathered around him. The Sugar Act, enacted on April 5, 1764, had been a calculated move by the British Parliament to increase revenue from the colonies. While the tax on molasses was reduced from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon, it was the enforcement that stung most. This act required colonists to pay a tax on goods that they had previously imported without restriction. John Hancock, a wealthy merchant and supporter of the resistance, leaned in closer, whispering to Adams, "This is an affront, and we must respond. The docks will be our front lines." On August 16, 1764, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a mob of disgruntled colonists gathered at Boston's waterfront. The atmosphere crackled with energy as they prepared to protest the enforcement of the Sugar Act. A sense of unity surged among them, fueled by the shared understanding that their livelihoods were at stake. The merchants, artisans, and laborers, who had once lived side by side in relative peace, now found themselves on opposing sides of an economic and ideological divide. "We will not be slaves to the Crown's greed," shouted one voice above the crowd, met with a chorus of agreement. As the mob marched toward the home of Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, they carried banners and torches, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Hutchinson's house was a symbol of the oppressive British rule, a target for their anger. "Let the governor see the resolve of the people," Adams urged, rallying the crowd. They reached Hutchinson's residence and began to chant, demanding the repeal of the Sugar Act and the end of British tyranny. The sound echoed through the streets, a clarion call for justice and autonomy. Inside, Hutchinson watched with mounting dread as the mob gathered outside. He penned a letter to the British authorities describing the scene with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "The people are stirred to a frenzy," he wrote, "their passions ignited by the promise of liberty, and yet they are blind to the chaos they unleash." His pleas for intervention would eventually reach London, but the response would be slow, and the situation would escalate further. Meanwhile, Samuel Adams and his fellow patriots strategized amongst the turmoil. They understood that this moment was a turning point. The resolve of the colonists was hardening. They were no longer passive subjects, but active participants in their fate. The conflict that had begun as a struggle against taxation now morphed into a broader fight for rights and recognition. The Boston Tea Party and the Continental Congress loomed on the horizon, but for now the mob's anger coalesced around the Sugar Act. As night fell, the mob grew restless. A few individuals, emboldened by the crowd's fervor, began to vandalize Hutchinson's property, smashing windows and tearing down his fence. The sound of breaking glass echoed ominously in the night. Adams, alarmed by the escalation, moved to calm the crowd. "This is not our way. We must stand for our rights without descending into chaos," he urged. His voice cut through the clamor, and for a moment the crowd hesitated. Just then, a shot rang out from the shadows, a single gunshot that pierced the night, sending a ripple of shock through the crowd. Panic ensued as the mob scattered, their unity fractured by fear. Samuel Adams stood still, his heart racing as he processed the gravity of the moment. This was not just a protest, it was the beginning of a violent confrontation that would shape the future of the colonies. In the days that followed, the unrest did not dissipate. Instead, it spread like wildfire. On July 4, 1764, the First Committee of Correspondence was convened in Boston, an act of defiance that would lay the groundwork for a united colonial front against British rule. James Otis's voice rang out in support of the gathering, emphasizing, "We must act as one body, for our liberties are at stake." By the autumn of that year, the tensions had reached a boiling point, with protests becoming more frequent and more organized. Merchants boycotted British goods, while pamphlets circulated across the colonies, spreading revolutionary ideas. "No taxation without representation" became the rallying cry, echoing in the hearts of many, from Boston to Virginia. Amid this growing unrest, the individuals we have followed, Adams, Hancock, and Otis, found themselves at the forefront of a movement that would change the course of history. They had become not just local leaders, but symbols of resistance against oppression. The Sugar Act, once a mere tax, had transformed into a catalyst for revolution, igniting a spirit of unity among the colonists that would soon lead to the Declaration of Independence. In the quiet moments, as Adams returned home after long days of organizing and strategizing, he reflected on the changes unfolding around him. The world was shifting, and he knew that the path forward would not be easy. Yet he remained steadfast, committed to the cause of liberty. "We shall endure," he whispered to himself, knowing that the fight for freedom had only just begun. As autumn leaves began to fall, the tension in Boston swelled with the promise of change. The Sugar Act had become more than a tax. It had crystallized a movement, a turning point that would echo through the ages. The cries for liberty, once whispered in taverns, now resonated in the hearts of a burgeoning nation. Each individual, each voice, played a part in the unfolding drama, paving the way for a legacy that would endure long after their time. In the summer of 1764, the air in Boston was thick with uncertainty. The Sugar Act had been enacted, and though the tax on molasses was reduced from 6 pence to 3, the spectre of British oversight loomed heavy over the colonists. Merchants who had once thrived in the bustling docks now faced an unsettling reality. Many had seen their profits dwindle, while others were forced to reckon with the oppressive weight of taxation on their livelihoods. In the wake of the initial outcry, the Green Dragon Tavern became a hub for discontent. On a sweltering evening in late August, Samuel Adams gathered with fellow patriots to discuss their next steps. "We must stand united," he urged, his voice steady yet urgent. "If we allow this tax to go unchallenged, what comes next?" The room was filled with nods of agreement, yet uncertainty hung in the air. Among them, John Hancock, whose shipping business had suffered a sharp decline, echoed Adams's sentiment. He had known prosperity, and now he faced the grim possibility of ruin. "We must organize protests, take a stand against these encroachments," Hancock declared, his resolve evident. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere in Boston grew increasingly charged. Protests erupted in the streets, with citizens voicing their anger at perceived injustices. On August 14th, a mob gathered near the home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, their chants echoing through the narrow streets. "No taxation without representation," they cried, their voices rising in a cacophony of defiance. Hutchinson, holed up in his residence, listened with a mix of fear and indignation. The tension was palpable. He had become a target for the very people he was sworn to govern. The mob's anger was not merely directed at Hutchinson himself, but rather at the very system that allowed such taxes to be imposed without consent. The rioters vandalized property, their frustration spilling over into violence as they tore down the effigies of tax collectors. Reports from that day reveal a scene of chaos. "They broke windows and doors," wrote one witness, "and in the heat of their fervor, they set fire to a building near the docks. The flames illuminated the night sky, a stark contrast to the calm waters of the harbor." In the months that followed, the impact of the Sugar Act began to ripple through the community. The once thriving economy suffered as merchants grappled with the burden of additional taxes. Many were forced to raise their prices, passing the cost onto consumers, which only fueled further resentment. In a letter dated November 10th, 1764, a merchant lamented, "The burden grows heavier each day, our customers dwindle, and the spectre of debt looms ever closer." This sentiment echoed through the taverns and marketplaces, where the atmosphere had shifted from one of camaraderie to a palpable sense of dread. Despite the unrest, the British authorities were resolute. In December, General Thomas Gage was appointed as the new commander of British forces in North America. Gage's orders were clear: maintain order and enforce the tax laws. He would soon face the impossible task of quelling the rising tide of rebellion. As he surveyed the streets of Boston, he was met not with the obedience he expected, but with a populace that was emboldened by their collective grievances. Witnesses noted a marked change in the demeanor of the colonists. "We were no longer just subjects," a local craftsman recalled in a diary entry. "We were becoming something more, citizens demanding our rights." The fight against the Sugar Act morphed into a broader struggle for representation, igniting a flame of rebellion that would not be easily extinguished. As winter approached, the protests took on a new urgency. On January 15, 1765, leaders from various colonies convened in a clandestine meeting to discuss their response to British taxation. The gathering was marked by a sense of unity, with delegates from as far as Virginia and New York. "We must present a united front," John Adams urged, "or risk losing everything our fathers fought for." The collective resolve of the attendees foreshadowed the coming storm, a storm that would soon engulf the colonies. The Sugar Act had sown discord, but it also fostered a sense of solidarity among the colonists. Craftsmen, merchants, and farmers began to recognize their shared plight, binding them together in a common cause. The streets of Boston became a crucible for revolutionary thought, where ideas of liberty and self-governance took root. In the months to come, the conversation shifted from mere protest to advocacy for rights. The Sons of Liberty, a group formed in direct response to the Sugar Act, began organizing boycotts against British goods. "We will not be subjugated," they declared, as reports of their activities spread throughout the colonies. The movement gathered momentum, transforming dissent into an organized effort for independence. By the spring of 1765, the repercussions of the Sugar Act were clear. The colonists had awakened to their power, and the British Parliament, blind to the brewing storm, continued to impose their will without regard for the voices of the people. The echoes of discontent grew louder, setting the stage for an inevitable confrontation. As the final days of winter faded, the people of Boston stood resolute, transformed by their struggles. They had not only endured the immediate aftermath of the Sugar Act, but had begun to forge a path toward a new identity. The streets, once filled with the sounds of commerce, now resonated with the rallying cries of freedom. The spirit of rebellion had taken root, and the journey toward independence was just beginning. In a quiet moment amidst the turmoil, a solitary figure stood on the docks, gazing out over the water. The harbor, once a symbol of prosperity, now reflected a deeper reckoning, a reckoning that would reshape the very fabric of their lives. The distant sound of a bell tolled, marking the passage of time and the unwavering resolve of a people on the brink of transformation. In the years following the tumultuous events surrounding the Sugar Act of 1764, the narratives of resistance and revolution began to crystallize into a powerful legacy that would shape the course of history. The Sugar Act itself, while seemingly a recalibration of tax policy, reducing the tax on molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon, was interpreted by the colonists as an affront to their liberties. It ignited a firestorm of dissent that transcended mere fiscal concerns, morphing into a broader struggle for autonomy against perceived tyranny. By 1776, the seeds of discontent sown in the wake of the Sugar Act had blossomed into full-scale rebellion. The Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773, became a symbol of defiance against British authority as colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This act of rebellion was fueled by the deep-seated resentment against taxation without representation, a sentiment that had taken root during the debates and protests surrounding the Sugar Act. The cry for freedom resounded through the colonies, echoing the sentiments articulated by figures like Samuel Adams, who fervently argued that there is nothing that a free man would not do to preserve his liberty. The Revolutionary War, which commenced in earnest in April 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord, was a direct response to the oppressive measures imposed by the British Parliament, including the Sugar Act. The conflict would ultimately redefine the political landscape of North America. By 1781, with the British surrender at Yorktown, the colonies emerged as a new nation, declaring their independence with the adoption of the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. The legacy of the Sugar Act, though it had sought to strengthen British economic control, instead catalyzed a movement that would culminate in the birth of the United States. However, the legacy of these events did not remain unexamined over the centuries. The narrative of the American Revolution, particularly the role of the Sugar Act, was often mythologized, framed as a pristine battle between liberty and tyranny. Historians such as Gordon S. Wood and Eric Foner have noted that the complexities of colonial society, including the diverse perspectives of loyalists, enslaved individuals, and indigenous peoples, were frequently overshadowed by a singular narrative that celebrated the patriots. The story became one of heroic struggle, yet it often glossed over the realities of class conflict and the contradictions inherent in a nation founded on principles of freedom while simultaneously upholding the institution of slavery. In the aftermath of the war, the newly formed United States faced the monumental task of creating a government that reflected the ideals fought for during the Revolution. The Constitution, ratified in 1788, sought to balance power and protect the rights of citizens. Yet the echoes of the Sugar Act's legacy persisted. Just as the colonists had resisted taxation imposed without representation, so too did the framers of the Constitution grapple with how to ensure that their new government would be accountable to its citizens. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, emerged as a response to these concerns, guaranteeing fundamental liberties and limitations on government power, a direct lineage to the resistance sparked by the Sugar Act. As the decades passed, the legacy of the Sugar Act continued to inform American political discourse. It became a touchstone for debates over taxation, representation, and civil liberties. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," evolved into a rallying cry not only for the Revolutionary War, but also for subsequent social movements, including the abolitionist movement and the struggle for civil rights. Each generation revisited the principles of the Revolution, drawing connections between the past and their ongoing struggles for justice and equality. By the 20th century, the mythos surrounding the American Revolution began to be challenged by scholars advocating for a more nuanced understanding of history. They highlighted the voices of those often marginalized in traditional narratives, advocating for a broader interpretation of what freedom and independence meant in a diverse nation. This shift in perspective reflects an ongoing effort to reckon with the complex legacy of the Sugar Act and its aftermath, recognizing that the fight for liberty was not a single linear struggle, but a multifaceted journey with many actors and many stories. Today, the legacy of the Sugar Act serves as a reminder of the power of collective action and the importance of representation in governance. It underscores the reality that laws and policies can have far-reaching consequences, shaping not only the immediate circumstances, but also the cultural memory and identity of a nation. The resentment ignited by the Sugar Act laid the groundwork for a revolution that would alter the course of history, prompting a re-evaluation of governance, rights, and what it means to be a citizen. In the quiet reflections on this legacy, one might consider the words of John Adams, who remarked, "The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people." The Sugar Act, with its seemingly mundane tax provisions, ignited a fervor that transformed a disparate group of colonies into a unified force demanding change. It is a testament to how even the smallest sparks can lead to monumental shifts, echoing through the annals of history. As you lie in the stillness of the night, think of the countless lives intertwined in this struggle. Those who fought, those who resisted, and those who dreamed of a different world. The Sugar Act, a mere footnote in the pages of history, became a catalyst for transformation, leaving an indelible mark on the fabric of a nation. The echoes of those who lived through it remain, whispering through time, urging us to remember that the journey for freedom is ongoing. As the echoes of the Sugar Act reverberate through the annals of history, we find ourselves reflecting on the intricate tapestry of human ambition and the relentless pursuit of freedom. The colonists, driven by their desire for autonomy, faced monumental challenges. They stood against not just a law, but an entire system that sought to impose its will upon them. Samuel Adams, in the heat of the struggle, once remarked, "It does not require a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen to set brushfires of freedom in the minds of men." This sentiment captures a fundamental aspect of human nature, the unwavering resolve to resist oppression even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the bustling streets of Boston, merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens were drawn together by a shared sense of purpose. They understood that their livelihoods were intertwined, that the struggle for a fair tax system was also a struggle for their very identities. The Sugar Act, while a mere tax on molasses, symbolized a much deeper fracture, one of trust, dignity, and respect between the colonies and their mother country. The colonists did not merely rise against a financial burden, they rose against an encroachment on their rights as Englishmen. This narrative also reveals our capacity for unity amid adversity. The Green Dragon Tavern, a bustling hub of revolutionary thought, became a sanctuary for ideas and plans, where men like John Hancock and Samuel Adams strategized their next moves. The warmth of camaraderie in those clandestine meetings contrasted sharply with the cold reality of their fight. Their ambition was fueled not by personal gain alone, but by a profound love for their communities and the future they envisioned for their children. Yet this story is not without its sobering truths. The path to freedom often comes with a heavy toll. The tension that simmered in Boston foreshadowed the bloodshed and heartache that would follow. As they rallied together, they were also confronted with the reality of division. Loyalties pulled in different directions, families torn apart by their beliefs. History teaches us that the pursuit of power can corrupt, that even the noblest of intentions can lead to unintended consequences. Ultimately, the tale of the Sugar Act serves as a reminder of our shared humanity. It demonstrates how the quest for justice is often fraught with complexities, yet it is also a testament to resilience. As the day fades into night, let this story linger, a gentle whisper of the struggles faced by those who sought to carve their own destiny. In the quiet moments before sleep, may we carry their lessons with us, a reminder of the enduring spirit that resides within us all. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the past, consider subscribing to Sleeping History Dreams for more long-form historical storytelling each week. Good night, and we'll see you in the next one.